Chapter 13. On the Streets. The house was too empty. At 13, I couldn't make myself stay indoors and read the works of Chairman Mao no matter how much I wanted to please father. Something had changed inside me, too. All the violence had numbed me, and I did not care if I never participated in the revolution again. My family had sacrificed so much for it, but it had given us nothing in return. If there was no one to care for me, why should I care for myself? I found myself wanting excitement, even danger, to throw myself against, and I did not care whether I came back dead or alive. My adventures began in the cold spring of 1968, a few months after my sisters left. With the return to the newspaper of my clever friend Little Li, it was his mother's turn to attend the study class, and there were no facilities at her unit for a child on his own. So although his father had left when mine had, Little Li came back to the apartment where he had grown up. Now we had 2 empty apartments to play in. He had fallen in with an unusual crowd, the sons of some of the highest-ranking cadres in all of Hunan province. Normally, we would never have met such privileged children, but Little Li had gone to the exclusive Heroes Training Primary School after his 4 years in the newspaper school. By rights, he should never have been there, but his mother had connections with the principal, so he was admitted through the back door to the training ground of Changsha's elite. Now the Cultural Revolution had brought these lofty scions of power down to our level, for they too had lost their parents. They came every day from their homes in the Hunan Provincial Party Committee compound and the restricted Hunan Provincial Military District to Little Li's house. We formed a kind of gang, an alliance of blood brotherhood sworn before a picture of Chairman Mao, but based more on outside threats than real fellow feelings. There were a lot of gangs in those days, for the city had lost all semblance of order. The notorious professional gangs from pre-liberation days had made their reappearance, and there were thousands of other young people on the streets. There were no schools to instruct or control them, and many of them had lost their parents to some form of re-education. So they banded together as a means of survival. Our group was one such example, but we were unlikely bedfellows. Our completely different reactions to the fall of our parents showed how far apart we really were. I wanted only to defend myself, but the high officials' children were planning revenge. They were used to power, and they were just as arrogant as they had been before the Cultural Revolution. Now they spoke constantly of what they would do to punish those who had written big character posters about their parents and beaten them in public. They noted down names and waited confidently for the day they would have their power back again. Their claim assurance was entirely foreign to me. We spent most of our time together learning how to fight. We really trained ourselves, practicing all kinds of martial arts. We hit bricks with our hands day after day until they bled, and then we fought the pain until the scabs hardened into calluses. I was growing now, shooting up like a young bamboo. The cuffs of my pants reached only to my calves. My shirt was tight across my chest. It felt good to hit things, to feel my new muscles harden and swell, my body damned to be tested. The high-ranking cadres' sons often brought liquor to Little Li's. Then we'd drink and fight among ourselves, 7 or 8 of us in a small room, not angry, but using our full strength because we loved to feel the hard thud of our fists in flesh, loved the comforting pain and the bruises we wore as emblems of our toughness. When at last the wine bottles glittered in pieces on the cement floor and our bodies ached, we would shake hands and light cigarettes for each other, expensive cigarettes purchased in exclusive hotels and shops for high-ranking cadres only. It was a good life. The 16-year-old leader of the group was the son of the Hunan Military Region Assistant Commander. His name was Cheng Guang, and I liked him very much, perhaps first because he was tall like me, but also because he was frank and open and had a tremendous tolerance for pain. I learned my discipline from watching him continue to work out when the rest of us could take no more, always slicing and kicking into the air with the force of a real battle. He was dark and handsome, with white northern skin and the suggestion of a mustache, and he never took off his real military clothing, even when the sweat had soaked through his jacket. I remember how he used to laugh at the Red Guards for their imitations of army uniforms, and he would show me the diagonal weave of his green jacket and say, "That is real PLA quality." I learned from him that you could always recognize a high-ranking cager's son by this jacket and the wide blue pants, white gloves, and black corduroy Peking-made shoes they like to affect. They wear that kind of informal uniform to this day. Cheng Guang shocked me a bit at first, for he had a girlfriend. This was unimaginable, not to say dangerous, for someone of his age. Everyone knew that you had to be at least 18 to begin even to think about such things. A classmate of Liang Fang's had been thrown out of school for his audacity. But Cheng Guang didn't even try to keep his girl a secret. He carried her photo in his breast pocket, and we saw she was plump and pretty, and had a fashionable short revolutionary haircut. When I had conquered my embarrassment, I discovered another emotion: envy. Little Li wanted to have nothing to do with teenage love affairs, for he had been well brought up and was even slightly stuffy. So when Cheng Guang asked us to correct a love letter he had written, elitist school or no, the children of intellectuals were still the better students. Little Li refused almost rudely. However, I sensed that one of the reasons Cheng Guang had cultivated our friendship was in hopes of just such help. In any case, I did not care what I got myself into, or what my reputation became. I ignored Little Li's frowns and invited Cheng Guang to come with me to my house. I felt shy to be alone with this boy I admired so much, and a bit ashamed of our bare-looking apartment with its broken windows and layer of dust. I unfolded his letter a bit awkwardly, but gained in confidence as I discovered that at least in studies, I was his superior by far. He had written many wrong characters, and his handwriting was poor. Blushing a little, I added the mouth to the character kiss, and rearranged the strokes in embrace. Remembering the Western stories I had read before the Cultural Revolution, I suggested it might be better to say that his girl's eyes were like the stars rather than like the moon, and he happily agreed. Then I recopied the whole thing for him. He was so grateful that our friendship entered a new phase. At the same time, cautious Little Li had set disappointing limits on how far he was willing to go for excitement. We drifted away from each other, and like many children who had nothing to do, he took to learn revolutionary songs on the violin. The musicality of many young people today is a direct result of this phase of the Cultural Revolution. For more than a month, Cheng Guang and I were like body and shadow. He often slept at my house or invited me to stay with him at the military headquarters. I had to climb over the wall because only army personnel were allowed in, but we were never discovered. I was not lonely anymore, and felt safe for the first time since father's posters has gone up more than 2 years earlier. No one could dare to hunt me with friends like these. One clear winter afternoon, the gang was to meet at my house to go to the Martyrs Park. Cheng Guang was late. We were joking about how he must have been delayed with his girlfriend when he came storming in. His fair skin flushed with anger and cold, his smooth brow creased in fury. "My brothers," he announced, "if you really are my brothers, remember, we swore with our blood. Now is the time to prove it. My girlfriend and I were just riding our bicycles by the river, and a bunch of hoodlums knocked her over and insulted her. And God damned if I wasn't alone. But I promised them we'd get back. We'll have a revenge." Defending the honor of a lady love was a bit alien to me, but I felt a thrill of excitement at the seriousness of his tone. Some of the other boys smiled a bit, though, and asked, "What did they say, that she was pretty?" Pretty? Nothing, exclaimed Chen Guang. They called her Mantou Mountain, that's what. He lifted his huge white gloves to his chest as if squeezing two large imaginary breasts. At this, even I laughed, but Chen Guang shouted, "What's so funny?" And we were instantly silent. He said, "We're meeting them tonight at 7 at the back gate of the park. It won't be easy because they're real black society, and there are a lot of them. We'll attack them hard and run for it, and they won't know what hit them." The high-ranking cadre's sons has organized themselves into ranks according to their father's positions, and Chen Guang was commander-in-chief. Despite their bravado, when they heard we were going to fight a real hoodlum, they were all afraid. But none of them raised a word of protest. I drew a deep breath. This was a far cry from our usual escapades, the most extreme of which had been grabbing a handful of oil cake tickets when a girl cashier wasn't looking. We had been practicing so long, this was the real thing. I made a fist and felt the strength cruising through my body. The shadows were long and the yellow moon hung low when I reached our meeting place, in a wooded corner of the park that night. Someone handed me 2 iron spikes to grasp in my fists. Most of them carried sticks and heavy tools. Chen Guang had a bundle with him, which he shoved at me. "Put these on," he whispered. "Don't ask any questions." I took out a green military jacket, a pair of white gloves, and a white face mask. The hoodlums were standing in the shadow of the trees beyond the gate. The streetlight caught the cigarettes hanging from the corners of their mouths. They seemed to be a motley group in dark work clothes, and most of them reached into their pockets when they saw us. My heart pounded. Maybe they were from the most terrible gang of all, the 5 Liu family tigers. A voice came out of nowhere. "Stinking black cadre sons, dogs relying on the strength of your masters." "Don't worry," Chen Guang whispered hoarsely. "Our victory lies in our escape. Listen for my signal to run." Then he called out with all his strength, "Fuck you and 3 generations of your ancestors." He ran forward with us at his heels. I was hitting in all directions, the iron spikes propelling my fists and making them powerful and heavy. Sometimes I connected with something and sometimes I didn't. I didn't even care. It was a terrific feeling. But not 20 seconds into the fight, I heard Chen Guang's call for retreat. I escaped before our opponents were able to land a single solid blow. They chased us, but the gate of the military headquarters was less than 100 yards away. Chen Guang had laid his plans well. The startled sentries let us by with a flash of confused recognition and then stood with bayonets raised against the tattered flood of hoodlums. Our cheated pursuers came to a furious halt. We were safe. Chen Guang's tactics and his military background saved us that time, but the conflict was far from over. Our enemies outnumbered us, and they lay in wait for Chen Guang outside his unit day after day until he hardly dared to go out at all. At last, he sent an emissary to negotiate with them, and at a price of 15 cartons of the best cigarettes was named. We talked them down to 8, which still came to more than 60 yuan. I contributed my remaining 14 yuan to help my friend out. The odd thing was that in the course of these discussions, hostility died away. We discovered that we had brought peace and friendship. Even now, there is a comfortable liaison between the sons of high-ranking cadres and the black society, dating from the Cultural Revolution days of gangs and alliances. I found myself unexpectedly drawn to these people, for coerced as they were, their feelings seemed natural and sincere. Whereas Chen Guang, I knew, would forget me when his father regained his high position. I actually had a lot in common with these hoodlums. The better I knew them and the hundreds of others with whom they associated, the less I saw them as hoodlums at all. A Among the younger ones, there were orphans, delinquents, peasants come illegally from the countryside, children like myself whose parents were in the study class or away in the countryside for thought reform, educated youths who were trying to avoid their stints among the peasants, and an odd assortment of other misfits who had found their way to the lowest reaches of society. Then there were the older people, the garbage collectors, cart pushers, outhouse cleaners, sellers of roasted sweet potatoes, and green onion pancakes deep fried in spattered oil. There were the key makers, the rice wine hawkers, the shoe and pot repairmen, the rat poison sellers. They did everything that lay beyond the reach of a normal government job. At first, I was merely curious about them, and then gradually I became one of them. I had hours to spare for their complaints and stories, and in the spring and summer of 1968, when I was 14, I was always with them in the tea houses, hardly bothering to go home anymore. Sleeping at the railroad station or anywhere else, I ended up late at night. Although they're miserably poor and their lives monotonous, they were truly free. In some way, they were beyond political life. Of course, they were occasionally arrested for conducting their illicit businesses or disturbing the peace, but as long as they didn't break any major law, they could curse the police, swear, complain, and speak their minds without repercussion. Movements came and went, but they always scraped up their few fen and drank their tea. They cared about each other too, and they came to care for me. They knew what had happened to my parents, and they sympathized and spoke out the things I hardly dared to think to myself. They said that the Cultural Revolution was a mistake, that my father had done nothing to be punished for, that children like myself shouldn't be living out on the streets with them, that we should be in school. I was deeply moved. Theirs were the first meaningful words of consolation I had heard since the Cultural Revolution began. It was a bitter freedom for me, though. I returned to the work of pushing cars, this time with no sense of stepping down in society. I saw the son of one of the most notorious rightists in the Hunan Daily, an older chief editor. If he had been pushing cards since 1957, why should I be ashamed? I got to know all the prices, learned how to help myself if I got a load of apples or bananas, learned what it was to sweat for a living. It was hard to earn enough, though. Even if you push until you were exhausted, there might be only 1 or 2 yuan a day. I had expensive new habits too. Wine and cigarettes sustained my friendships and dulled my pain. So I sold my family's leather suitcases for 8 yuan apiece, and sometimes I crawled into the newspaper's dining hall window at night and stole mantou, potatoes, eggs, chicken. After I had filled my belly, I always felt wretched, for I knew how sad father would be if he knew I was a thief and a hoodlum. I could not help myself. My life was like a feather to me, floating on thrills, wine, cigarettes, and curses. One of those who befriended me was an old man we called Pockmarked Liu, a bony fellow with sunken, cratered cheeks and tobacco-stained teeth the color of grasshopper juice. A scar on the back of his neck stretched partway up his scalp, cutting a taut white swath among the great stubble of his hair. His dirty undershirt stretched over the sharp curve in his upper back, and his sandals always looked so large I couldn't imagine how he kept them on his feet. He had a touch of asthma, and his voice rasped when he made his crude jokes, but through his vulgarity and ironic cynicism, he was among the kindest of the whole lot. I met him pushing carts. When he saw that I was new, he yielded a job to me. And then when I returned to thank him, he told me all the places where I could get free boiled black tea, the kind that's so bitter that you want to grimace. but that can restore the life in anyone. Later, when he switched to selling oil pancakes at the gate of the Martyrs Park, he always urged them on me free of charge. But I never allowed myself more than one because I knew he needed money just as much as I did. Then I didn't see him for a month or so, and finally ran into him at the Northern Station, where he was just coming out of one of the offices. He looked filthy, and from 10 yards away I could smell something overpowering and distinctive, very familiar but not quite identifiable. He greeted me enthusiastically, but waved me back, calling, "This pig slop will crawl right over you if you don't watch out." "What have you been doing with pigs?" I asked, keeping my distance. "Mothering them along to Guangzhou. 20 yuan a shot," he answered. "Gotta get them there alive for Hong Kong went by. Say," he said, grinning his copper-colored grin, "they might take you on if I backed you. How about it?" I would have been a fool to say no. 20 yuan was more than I'd seen since father had been sent to the study class. We agreed to meet that afternoon after he'd been to the bathhouse. My height proved useful. Pockmarked Liu told the railroad official that I was 18 and had some experience with animals. After a warning about not trying to sneak out to Hong Kong with the pigs, I was hired. The next morning, Pockmarked Liu let me pass the dozens of cars of oxen, chickens, ducks, geese, rabbits, and fish towards the pig section. Each car had its own particular stench and noises, its own particular collection of eyes staring through the slats. There were at least 30 pigs in our two-level car, huge monsters, any one of which weighed twice what I did. They had beady, intelligent eyes that followed us as we walked to the entrance, and a spectacular and varied range of vocal expression. Our narrow bunks at the end of the car were separated from our charges by a thin slatted wall with a little doorway in it, but we were to spend most of our time inside with them, feeding them, changing their water, hosing away their shit, making sure they don't get sick and die on us. Suddenly I wasn't sure if it was all worth it, even for 20 yuan, but Pockmarked Liu had already uncurled the hose and handed it to me, and I was at work. Worst of all was feeding them. You had to crouch over nearly double, their slop in wooden buckets on your shoulder pole, while they rushed at you grunting and screaming, each trying to be the first to eat. The train shook and rattled so they were unsteady on their feet, and I was terrified that one of them might fall over and crush me. I might be stamped into their muck before Pockmarked Liu even had a chance to notice what was happening. My back ached after only an hour, and I stank as if I had rolled in the stuff deliberately. It was frightening to think I had 4 feedings and 5 changes of water ahead of me during the 2.5-day trip. The brunt of the labor would be mine because Pockmarked Liu was old, and I owed him his rest. Sleep was impossible that night. The stench was so pervasive, I felt I was gasping for air, and the noises were insistent and always changing. 30 pigs never piss at the same time. Every few minutes came the hard, swift, hissing sound, punctuated by the pigs' continuing grunts and screams and the lowing of oxen from the car behind. Not even the gentle rhythm of the train in motion could rock me to sleep. It must have been well after midnight that we rumbled to an unscheduled stop. In the relative silence, I heard Pockmarked Liu toss on the bunk beneath mine, and I realized he couldn't sleep either. "Old Liu," I called out softly, "are you hungry?" I waved half a manteau down into the blackness below, and felt the touch of his gnarled hand. "Thank you, tall fellow," he answered. "I could use a bite. It's hard to eat when everything stinks so, though." I leaned over the edge of the bunk and looked down. "Aren't you used to it yet?" "Never will be. Heaven knows I've done everything in this life, from beekeeping to teaching school, but this is the worst. You can never wash yourself clean." "I didn't know you were a teacher," I said. So Pockmarked Liu told me his story. He had once been a worker in a towel factory, supplementing his income by renting out 2 rooms. After liberation, the rooms were confiscated and he and his wife sent to the countryside because they belonged to an oppressing class. There, because he had read a few books and could write a fair hand, he was asked to teach primary school. Then in 1958, during the Great Leap Forward, when the People's Communes were formed, he had complained about the food in the new collective dining hall, and he was severely criticized. His teaching job was taken away. Fuck, he swore. What a fool I was to complain. Actually, if only they'd keep us a few more of those stupid policies, we wouldn't have an overpopulation problem. I remembered Father's description of the peasants lying dead in the fields during the early 1960s disasters that followed the commune movement, and I understood his humor. "Where's your family?" I asked. "The world is my family. When my wife was in the countryside, she picked up a lot of the local superstitions, and one of them killed her," he said, laughing again, but bitterly. "One day she heard a crow cawing in the eaves, and an old neighbor woman told her it meant that an army would be passing soon. My wife repeated the news everywhere, and it got to the brigade leaders. 3 weeks later, we heard Chiang Kai-shek was invading, so the leaders decided to make an example out of her for welcoming the enemy. They locked her up in a dark room and beat her." Mark Liu paused for a moment and resumed in a huskier voice. "A few days later, she got out and jumped into the pond. A lot of people have died, all of them good people." I did not know what to say, and I stammered. "Well, I guess my family is pretty lucky." "Oh, I don't know about that," he said. "My wife's free now, and even though I'm the lowest of the low, so am I. I don't have to answer to anybody. Sometimes it's even worse if you try to believe in it all. So many fools give thanks for getting shit thrown in their faces. Don't be duped like them, tall fellow. The more you believe, the more you've lost, and the more of a sucker you are." His words made me think of Father. Although I didn't say anything, I still thought it was good that his beliefs were so strong, that he was so patient. If Father's convictions were any less, he might well kill himself like Mark Liu's wife. And I wasn't ready to look at death as freedom. I felt confused, but comforted myself with the thought that most people were like my father, and there were only a handful like the old man in the bunk below. I changed the subject. "I wonder why we've stopped." "It's probably the fish. The water spills or a tank springs a leak and someone has to fill it up again. Last time we stopped for more than 3 hours." His words made me drowsy, and the pigs too seemed to be sleepy at last. "Let's sleep, shall we, Lao Liu?" I said. "Good dreams, tall fellow." But that night I dreamt of thousands of pigs with thousands of eyes, all staring at me hungrily. At last we arrived in Guangzhou. I had been looking forward to calling on my pretty little friend Sha-an, for I had not forgotten her tears of farewell when she saw me and Liang off at the station years before. I was wondering, too, about her family's fortunes during the Cultural Revolution, for her father, like mine, made his living with his pen. It wasn't until after I had been to the bathhouse and bathed until my fingers were white and wrinkled with absorbed water that I realized I couldn't possibly go. The odor of pig piss, shit, sweat, and slop lingered, and even the fresh clothing I had placed under the tattered quilt was permeated with it. I got sadly onto the next train home with Mark Liu, 2 10-yuan bills burning like hot coals in my pocket. "Now I can come home every week. Why weren't you there? Next Sunday I hope the place is cleaner. It looks like the dogs have been living here. Your father." I found this note one Friday afternoon in the winter of 1968. It had been more than a week since I'd been home. That morning I had been drinking harsh white liquor with my friends, throwing it down my throat as if it were the fire we were too poor to buy. Father's elegant characters looked incongruously graceful under a scrap of faded newspaper, and they sobered me instantly. I sank down on my dirty, crumpled quilt and burst into tears. What must we have thought when he smelled the acrid dust and saw it lying thick and gray over my bowl and chopsticks? Had he noticed the disappearance of the leather suitcases and the mosquito net? Had he shivered as the wind blew through the unplugged windows? I trembled to think that he might have guessed at the life I was living, and realized frantically that I had less than 2 days to put my affairs in order and think of a plausible explanation of where I had been. Not even Liang Wei-ping could have worked like I did, and by the following afternoon the dust was gone. Almost every sheet and quilt cover flapped wetly on the communal clothesline, and a few rays of winter sunlight shone down to dry them. My hands were icy red from the scrubbing, and I ached from strange new exertions, but I couldn't rest. I sat down to make up all the entries I had missed in my study diary, copying down titles of articles and chapters from the works that I had meant to read. I knew little Lee would coach me. At last I was ready. He arrived early Sunday morning. It was an odd visit, since we were intensely curious about each other's lives while defending our own secrets fiercely. His temper was worse than I'd ever seen it. Sometimes he paced back and forth like a tiger in a cage. Sometimes he lay down on the bed, sucking furiously on his cigarettes, sighing deeply. I told him I'd been staying at Little Lee's, and he looked at me sharply and then lectured me on the importance of study. He told me about a colleague's daughter who had been living on the streets. She had become pregnant and been arrested and sent to a labor camp. He said he hoped I wouldn't bring him shame and trouble. I protested vigorously, but he looked at me with those stern, deep, suffering eyes, as if he already knew everything. I was able to gather that he was home because his historical question had been resolved. In fact, his problem was no worse than most, but he had been kept in the study class without visiting privileges because there had been some uncertainty about his motivation in joining the KMT Youth League. And the matter of his brother and sister who went to Taiwan with the KMT had to be investigated. Now he had been cleared, and it was only a matter of time before he was liberated and sent to the countryside. He had written about his historical questions so often that it had aged and wearied him, and now that his exoneration was in hand, he seemed too broken to enjoy it. On subsequent Sundays, I learned more about his life in the study class and came to understand why he was always so irritable when he came home. Everyone was part of a bred couple and had a partner to whom he had to report the thought of every moment, even his dreams. If his thought was revolutionary and loyal, he was encouraged, but if he felt homesick or missed his children or his wife, he was guilty of private thought and was criticized. Father's partner was an old colleague named Tang, and they knew each other's thoughts more intimately than lovers, and ruled one another with iron hands. When father came home, all the worry and discontent he had to hide from his partner spilled forth. "What do they want from me?" he used to mutter over and over to himself. "I've told them everything 100 times." Father's return put an end to my wanderings. I called on little Lee and discovered he had been studying at home the whole time and had also become a rather accomplished violinist. I joined him and his friends in their studies, and we read the works of Marx and Lenin as well as those of Chairman Mao. Like my father, I took copious notes and was thorough in my readings. Everything I read told me socialism was glorious. Perhaps there were so many inequities in our own society simply because people hadn't carried out Chairman Mao's directives. Despite what my fellow students and I had been through, none of us had lost our faith. When we weren't working hard, we learned to play instruments, raised pigeons, and waited dutifully for our parents to come home.